Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kais. Thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network. And you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on TBTRN. So God Save the King is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to retelling the nativity story the way it really would have happened, or at least as close as we can discover. This is an ongoing investigation dedicated to discovering what the real nativity really would have looked like. And this is because, frankly, the traditional nativity story is, in fact, Christian mythology and only bears the vaguest resemblance to, again, what really would have happened. So if you like content like this, would you please make sure to like, follow, and subscribe my posts and my videos? Frankly, both mine and those of the Truth Be Told radio network. You can go to my website or their website. My website is www.godsavetheking.org. Truth Be Told Radio Network is, of course, www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. And there, of course, is our main websites, plus social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Rumble, etc. And you know the drill. Please help us out by liking, following, subscribing to our posts and our videos. But like I said, the traditional nativity story is, in fact, Christian mythology and really only bears the vaguest resemblance to what really would have happened. Yes, a lot of the bullet points remain the same. Joseph and Mary traveling to Nazareth, the shepherds found a baby in a manger, okay, but not necessarily in a stable, etc., etc. We cover that in other episodes, that a lot of the bullet points remain the same, but the truth is in the details. So God Save the King is based on four fundamental premises that I've talked about in detail before, but we'll just blaze through them really quick here. Number one, Jesus was not born on December 25th. Number two, tradition is not evidence. Very simple. Tradition is not evidence. Number three, the traditional versions of the nativity story are rarely told in their historical context. And that, unfortunately, deprives the learner and the searcher of real benefit and real context and real meaning and understanding behind the nativity story. Because frankly, I believe that the real nativity story actually takes on greater meaning than the traditional nativity story. Did I say that right? The real nativity story takes on greater meaning than the traditional nativity story. And then finally, number four, okay, real quick. One, not born on December 25th. Number two, tradition is not evidence. Three, the traditional versions of the story are rarely told in historical context. Number four, the nativity is not a Christian story. And I'm not trying to offend people by saying that. That's just the simple truth. It's not a Christian story. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were not the first Christians. They were Jews. Okay? Joseph was a Jew. Mary was a Jew. Jesus was a Jew. And everything they would have done and said would have attested to the fact that they were ethnic Jews, right? So the nativity story is a Jewish story, and frankly, we have to return it to its Hebraic context in order for Christians to properly understand it. It's really just that simple. And the nativity story has been a victim of what I've referred to many times, paraphrase from Peter Jackson's treatment of the Lord of the Rings trilogy: history became legend, legend became myth, and things that should not have been forgotten were lost. And it's really just that simple. The real nativity story has been lost due to Christian mythology and also something else, not just mythology and the fact that we have this entire alternate story that really isn't true, but also we have to rescue truth from familiarity. I've been having this happen to me in my personal life a lot lately with my own walk with God, where I am reading stories that I have read hundreds, if not thousands of times, and seeing them in an entirely new light, simply because I tell myself, okay, I'm really, really, really familiar with the story, and familiarity is not always a good thing. So oftentimes we need to rescue truth from familiarity. So before we get into today's content, I do want to remind you there are a multitude of great ways to listen to my show and the other great shows on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. You can, of course, go to the Truth Be Told Network website and click on the big listen button. That's www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. You can listen on your phone or any smart device. There we go. On the Android app, the My Tuner app, the Wi-Fi radio app, the TuneIn radio app, and of course, Alexa, Google, and Apple home devices, where you can just say, hey Google, or hey Siri, etc. Hey Alexa, play Truth Be Told Radio Network. And last but not least, you can also call in on your phone, dial in and listen that way. 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977. That's great for phones with unlimited long distance, so you don't have to eat up your data. So once again, thank you for listening to my show, God Save the King, every Friday night at 10 p.m. on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. So now, a couple of shows back, my guest Michael Parker and I, we jumped right into identifying the Star of Bethlehem, but we actually offered very little background information at that time. So last week when I recorded my show, I said, I really want to restart this conversation and go back and build the case from the ground up, okay? Because like I said, we went right to the punchline. We just jumped over all of this introductory information, all of this building block evidence, and went straight to the punchline and said, this is what I believe the Star of Bethlehem was, and we neglected the background. So in the last show, we started some background, and today I want to continue with that background. I want to share some very fundamental facts with you about ancient astronomy, about how it worked. I want to discuss at least briefly, what some of the other options are, okay, and why I either do or don't think those options, line up very well. But the first thing I want to share with you today is actually a correction from last week's show. A little bit of the slip of the tongue there. I was talking about the number of books and articles that had been recorded in that bibliography in the Library of Congress, and I called 1979 50 plus years ago, and I guess I must have been focused in on the 1970, not the 1979, because 1979 obviously is only a little over 40 years ago, not 50 years ago. But a little bit of the slip of the tongue, slipped a couple of digits doing the math there, but just a quick correction there. So to review here, but also to frankly kind of give you the punchline up front, the Star of Bethlehem was not a singular astronomical event, but was in fact a highly concentrated series of astronomical events that began on July 29th of 3 BC and ended October 14th of 2 BC. And this highly concentrated series of astronomical events, it all revolved around, pun intended, the king planet of Jupiter, the king star of Regulus, in the royal sign of Judah. Okay, now there's much more to it than that. That's a very quick overview and summary, and we're going to talk much more about these events in detail, but there it is. A highly concentrated series of astronomical events between July 29th of 3 BC and October 14th of 2 BC involving the king planet Jupiter, the king star Regulus, and all in the royal sign of Judah. Now, some of these individual events, because it's a series, like I said, a highly concentrated series of events. Some of these events were unprecedented in their own right. I'll talk about that a little bit more just in a couple of seconds here. So some of the events were unprecedented in their own right, but really it was this highly concentrated nature of unprecedented events that in turn made it unprecedented, this highly concentrated series of highly symbolically significant, thematically interconnected celestial events that frankly motivated the Magi to travel to Jerusalem and to Bethlehem. I mean, that's a big deal. To see a sign that you go, oh my God, we've got to get up and go now. That's really, really, really a big deal. So the first event, okay, which was the heliacal rising of Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus in the constellation of Leo, that is what took place on the morning of July 29th, 3 BC. And I believe that this event is after a fashion unprecedented. Now, if you do the math, you can discover that this event was possible mathematically something like 3,000 years earlier, right? But based upon the recorded history of celestial observation in Mesopotamia, although it is mathematically possible, I believe that this particular heliacal rising of Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus in Leo was, after a fashion, unprecedented, because this would have been the first time it would have been actively observed in human history. Keywords there being actively observed, because the Magi would have gone out in the morning preparing for their morning observation before sunrise. They would have been aware that the heliacal rising was approaching, right? Because they used a combination of mathematical calculations combined with legitimate, naked eye observation. And they would have gone out and seen that little glimmer of Jupiter before the sun obscured it from view. And it would have been, like I said, in conjunction with Regulus in Leo. And according to the astrological omens of that time, when the heliacal rising of a planet occurred in the same constellation as the sun, then that amplified the omen, okay? If the planet was in a different constellation than the sun, which ironically is what happened a year later in 2 BC, then that diminishes the importance of the omen, okay? This amplifies the importance of the omen. But what we're going to do today, so that's my theory. That's what I believe the Star of Bethlehem was. And like I said, throughout this show and throughout subsequent shows, we're going to talk more and more about why I believe that is the case. I'm going to present my evidence for why I believe that is so. But, one of the things we're going to do today is we are going to talk about some of the alternate explanations for what the Star of Bethlehem may or may not have been, and frankly, why I think these explanations don't work. But to wrap up my explanation, I want to emphasize the fact that although this was, like I said, this is an unprecedented series of events, and it was the concentration of these events that was really unprecedented, right? To top it all off was the fact that this really was a normal star, right? The planet, right? It's the planet Jupiter. But the Star of Bethlehem is best identified as a normal star, a planet in its normal course. But it was the expertise of the wise men in celestial observation and arcane wisdom that allowed them to identify an unprecedented series of celestial events as pointing to the birth of the Messiah of Israel. That is the key to understanding it, because one of the things that we're going to emphasize throughout today's show is we're going to emphasize the fact that according to the text, when you read Matthew chapter 22, one of the facts that seems to stand out is that the Magi appear to have been the only ones who could see this. Everybody else appears to have been, unaware of what was going on. So that is one of the criteria that we're going to use here in a minute to discuss why I think certain um, options, frankly, don't work. Is because if they would have been easily seen by someone other than the Magi, then you've got a pretty big obstacle that you've got to explain and you've got to overcome as to why that option is actually the Star of Bethlehem and not what I'm talking about here. Now, just as a point of conversation, I need to mention the fact that I watched a new video within about the past week. I say new because it was posted on YouTube like within the last 6 to 8 weeks, right? And it was a new video on the Star of Bethlehem. And what was interesting about this is that it was posted by two ministries, two Christian ministries that base their ministry on apologetics and scientific investigation, right? And what was really interesting about this show, I hate to say this, I hate to be that guy, but I'm going to be that guy, which is, man, were they unconvincing. Well, I'll tell you what their conclusion was here in a minute, but for two ministries that say they base their ministry on apologetics and on scientific discovery, it was really unimpressive. It was outrageously unimpressive. And frankly, their conclusion was pretty unconvincing as well. But remember, we're talking about a really enigmatic record here. Matthew chapter 2, which I've mentioned before, the reason we call this enigmatic is because it provokes as many, if not more, questions than it provides answers. Just that simple. More questions than answers, right? And not just the star. Now, the star is the centerpiece, right? What did the Magi see? That clearly and obviously is the centerpiece, but there's all kinds of really, really interesting questions that we can ask about this based upon their interaction with Herod. I mean, why did they travel, right? And why did they travel into a foreign country, right? How did they know what to look for, et cetera, et cetera? All these questions, but it all focuses around this question of what did they see? Now, last week, we also talked about the fact that out of all of these books, right, that we referenced, most of them were written by astronomers. And many astronomers, maybe not all, but most astronomers consider themselves scientists, and therefore they consider themselves secularists, and also consider themselves, frankly, skeptics. And given the fact that the Gospel of Matthew is the only record in all of world literature that mentions this star, it's frankly not too surprising to discover that a lot of these scientists want to dismiss this star as either not having happened at all, or it's got some mystic explanation, which they will say quite honestly and forthrightly and not altogether incorrectly that, well, that's not our area of expertise. We're scientists. And since we as scientists can't prove this, then it's our opinion that it doesn't exist, right? Now, what's interesting about this, especially in the culture today, because for a couple of years now, we've been hearing all over the mainstream media and social media people saying, follow the science, believe the science, follow the science, believe the science. And science means exploration. Science means never stopping asking questions, right? And astronomy, wow. I mean, if this isn't the perfect place to cite examples of not asking questions, cite examples of not stopping asking questions, this is it. Because, there was a time in the world of astronomy that they didn't necessarily understand they were talking about something three-dimensional, right? They didn't have that figured out. There was definitely a time in the world of astronomy where they didn't understand a heliocentric solar system. Okay. So the discoveries that have happened in the past several thousand years in the field of astronomy have helped us understand what it was the Magi saw, because they had a different perspective. But science and this is going to offend a lot of people, science is not the only way of discerning information. Sorry, it's not. There's many different ways of discerning information, and science is only one of them. And when you're studying the field of archaeoastronomy, okay, which is by definition the study of the practice of astronomy in ancient cultures, okay, that's what archaeoastronomy is archaeoastronomy is studying what did ancient cultures know and understand and believe about astronomy. And archaeoastronomy is also an interdisciplinary bridge that connects the fields of astronomy, archaeology, cultural history, and the history of astronomy. Okay. And the irony is if that's what you're studying and that's what you're trying to understand, ironically, science can almost stand in the way. If you think that science is the only way of discerning information, you got a problem, okay? Because the principal barrier standing in our path, okay, to understanding archaeoastronomy is our addiction to the way modern science has taught us to view space and time. Okay? There you have it, right? Because it was, as I mentioned before, it was the fact that the Magi could identify these stars is, what makes this so interesting. See, here you go again. The Star of Bethlehem is best defined as a normal star, a planet, in its normal course, but it was the expertise of the wise men in celestial observation and arcane wisdom, there you go, that allowed them to identify this unprecedented series of celestial events as pointing to the birth of the Messiah of Israel. And that is because these these signs, right, involving Jupiter and Regulus in Leo, they were symbolically significant and thematically interconnected. See, because according to the ancients, according to ancient astronomers and astrologers, the stars speak, okay? And the Bible even says that. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day they utter speech, and night unto night they show knowledge. And that is not just clever, pretty, poetic language. That is telling us that the stars speak, okay? So it really is the celestial observation and the arcane wisdom of the Magi that allowed them to decipher this riddle of what it was they were seeing and thereby receive the message that was being spoken of in the stars. The heavens declare the glory of God. And if the birth of Jesus Christ isn't a giant chunk of the glory of God, I don't know what is. Okay, so the heavens declare the glory of God. Now, let me, I'm going to just take a second here and I'm going to jump over to my screen share here and punch up one of my other graphics. Okay, that's not the one I want. I want that one right there because just once again, we've been through that. That's not the one I want. Let me get rid of that. So, but let me get back to where we were moving here. So one of the things, a detail that I want to share with you that will help us understand things is the fact that what the Magi were looking at is that they were looking at the planets against the backdrop of the stars. Okay. So one of the things that will help us understand this is that when you're talking about legitimate stars, as opposed to planets, right? Remembering that the Greek word aster, as we pointed out last time, the Greek word aster, as it is used in the Bible and as it is used in common Greek, okay, can refer to a singular star. It can refer to a planet. It can refer to an entire constellation or asterism, okay? So while it is clearly astronomical lingo, it is astronomical lingo in layman's terms, okay? Astronomical lingo in layman's terms. So to help us understand what the Magi were looking at, they were looking at the planets, which they would have simply called a star, right? Because observationally, they would have been able to see, yeah, that twinkly light right there, it moves in an entirely different fashion than all these other twinkly lights. All those other lights, frankly, kind of stand still. They move, but they move really slow. But the planets move, and they move much quicker, so you can watch the planets against the backdrop of the stars. Now, the reason this occurs is because the stars, quote unquote, that we are looking at are outside of our solar system. They are, number one, they are much further away, okay? And then in contrast, the planets are within our solar system and are orbiting around our sun just like we are. So they are much closer, which is why they appear to move much faster. But then to top it off, you've got our solar system moving through our galaxy, and then you've got our galaxy moving through the universe, which is a just gigantic, enormous context that paints for us this backdrop of the stars. And so the motion of our solar system through our galaxy and through the universe is known as precession. It's sometimes called the precession of the equinox. And we'll talk more about that in more detail in another show. But that's a big part of why when we watch the planets move much quicker against the backdrop of the stars appear to move much slower, right? Or appear, they do. They move, but they move a lot slower, okay? So now one of the things I said is I want to do today is I want to go through some of these alternative explanations and talk about why I either do or don't believe they have any merit. And like I said, it was really interesting to watch this other video the other day that here, like I said, it is being posted by two, not one, but two Christian ministries that they claim are devoted to apologetics and scientific understanding. And frankly, I was stunned at their conclusion if they think that they are in support of about apologetics and science, right, and creation science. I found their arguments extremely unpersuasive, okay? But that's what I want to get in tonight is the fact that, we do have these alternative explanations, right? We have these alternative explanations. So the short list is some people say, okay, it was a comet. Some people say, okay, it was a nova or a supernova. Others say it was an angel. And some say it was the Shekinah glory of God. And I want to talk about each one of these, okay? But these are the somewhat more traditional understandings. When you see a traditional version of the nativity story, although they usually don't go into detail about identifying the star, when you're looking at the traditional version of the story, it's always, oh, it's just that mysterious star. They leave it at that. Oh, it's mysterious. We don't get it. We don't understand it. All we know is that it led the wise men to Bethlehem, right? Which, see, that is one of the issues right there. And it's frankly where I want to start this, is with the notion that the Star of Bethlehem was either a visual or a directional guide. Okay, so traditional versions of the Nativity contain many assumptions about the Star of Bethlehem. Most, if not all of them, are often unspoken and unproven. In fact, many of them are, frankly, they are unprovable. It's just a theory, and you can't really offer much evidence, let alone proof that, okay, that's what it is, okay? But part of the challenge here, as I mentioned earlier in the show, is the fact that context indicates that whatever this was, whatever the star was, context indicates it was something only the Magi saw. Everyone else appears to have been clueless, right? When they show up at the court of Herod the Great and they say, we have seen his star in the east, Herod doesn't say, oh, I know, we've been watching it too, right? And Herod's wise men don't say, yep, oh yeah, we've been tracking it as well, right? So this is a real challenge to any theory that supposes this star was conspicuous in any way. So the notion that it was a visual guide or a directional guide, right, is really, really challenging, because the fact that the context indicates that only the Magi could see it, that argues against it. Those you have two mutually exclusive ideas, right? If only the Magi saw it, then how the heck did it lead or guide them to where they were going? It would have had to have been conspicuous in some fashion. And if it had been conspicuous, then frankly, it would have drawn a crowd. All right, because this was a culture when, pardon me, this was a culture that was much more in tune with the night sky than we are. Now, that doesn't mean everybody was an expert, not by a long shot, but when you had very, very limited artificial light, and if you were outside at night, you would spend a lot of time looking at the stars, and you'd get really used to going, oh yeah, that's that over there, and that's that over there, and yeah, I recognize that one. Yeah, it's there every night, and it's that, or that one's there this time of year every year, right? You'd really get used to it. And of course, in our story, the perfect example, of course, is the shepherds. The shepherds are a perfect example of a group of people that would have been outside at night and therefore would have gotten used to seeing the stars in certain directions at a certain time of year. That I see that configuration over there, that configuration over there, etc. Right? So aside from the notion that the Magi would have used these as a general navigational tool, which had been being done for quite a while, even already at that point, this notion that they followed this star, frankly, is ridiculous. Now, we know where they get the idea from. There are several phrases in the Gospel of Matthew that make it sound like this was not a normal star. Okay. And that's the typical explanation. I mean, I've already mentioned it in other shows. I watched a different video. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that I saw a presentation unrelated to the Star of Bethlehem by a minister that I really respect, but he decided to go there for a minute, and he went there and he goes, oh yeah, this is not a normal star. And I'm going, oh my word, I can't believe I heard you say that. Would you please look at the evidence, because you're clearly not looking at the evidence, right? So apart from being a very general navigational tool, right, the notion that the Magi would have followed this thing is pretty ridiculous. Also, you've got to remember the fact that, roads existed back then, and the road from Mesopotamia to Judea would have been well known. Okay. This was, as a matter of fact, and we'll go there at another episode, this was about 150 to 200 years after the Parthians had opened up the Silk Road. Okay. Now that's something that that's a word phrase that a lot of people are going to recognize. But this is the Silk Road, very simply, it's not a singular road, it's a network, but it's a network of trade routes that extended from, at the very least, the Near East all the way to the Far East. So what we would call Upper Mesopotamia, Lower Mesopotamia, what we would call Syria, right? And extending into the Levant, extending up into Asia Minor, extending south into Egypt, and then all the way through Central Asia, okay, and into the Far East in China. That's the Silk Road, right? And the Parthians opened up the Silk Road. In other words, if you were traveling from west to east, right, you would be able, once you hit Central Asia, that's the worst part of the trip. That's where you're in really high mountains and super rugged terrain, and it's a difficult portion of the route to traverse, right? Now, I don't mean to get derailed by the Silk Road here, but usually you didn't travel the entire Silk Road by yourself. It was traveled in segments. You wouldn't start at one and go to the other by yourself. But the point of all this is that roads were in existence, and how you get from Mesopotamia to Judea would have been well known. Okay, they wouldn't have needed a directional guide. They would have went, oh, we need to go to Jerusalem, which they apparently already knew. See, also that's part of the context, is that they apparently, because they knew it was the newborn king of the Jews, the new king of the Jews, well, they also kind of already knew that Herod was the king of Judea because, see, they would have had diplomatic relations with Judea. Babylon and Judea had had interconnected diplomatic relations for 600 years at this point, close diplomatic relations. So this isn't the mystery a lot of people think it is. Also, another detail is that once the Magi arrived in Jerusalem, it was Herod that told them to go to Bethlehem. So so if this was a directional aid or a visual aid to guide them to the Christ child, well, how did they get to Jerusalem? Because the way the text reads, okay, maybe the star guided them to Bethlehem, but the star didn't guide them to Jerusalem. They traveled to Jerusalem on their own. Okay. So like I said, there are some real challenges here to the notion that it was a visual or directional guide right from the text itself. Because like I said, this appears to have been something that only the Magi saw. It was not something conspicuous. And those two ideas, they bang heads. They don't work together. They are mutually exclusive. Okay. So now moving on to a couple of these other theories, right? When I watched this video that I've mentioned, with the apologetics and scientific ministries here, they even had a man who had a PhD in astronomy as their subject matter expert. The irony is that not once did they actually talk about the possibility of a series of unprecedented events, of conjunctions and eclipses and heliacal risings, because that's what we have here. We've got all of the above, right? You've got heliacal risings, you've got conjunctions, you've got lunar eclipses, you've got all kinds of things happening in the constellation of Leo with the planet Jupiter and the star Regulus. And that's what's got these guys' attention, is, like I said, this unprecedented series of highly concentrated events, right? These guys didn't mention that once. Not once. All they did is they just, what's the word I want to use? They just mimicked this saying of, well, it's clearly not a normal star, so therefore it had to have been something special God made for just the occasion. Well, so their explanation is really no explanation, right? So so basically what they're trying to say is that it was something supernatural, or it was something miraculous. And this is a common explanation. It's not a very good one. It's not a very good explanation at all, because number one, the text doesn't really indicate that. Okay. If it had been supernatural or miraculous, wouldn't the Magi have said something more like that than say, we have, saw his star? So the miraculous supernatural view of the Star of Bethlehem raises a lot of questions, but it's specious in nature. It appears plausible, but it actually lacks real merit, because by trying to cite, a supernatural or miraculous quality to the event, it by definition kind of places it in a realm that doesn't require explanation, right? And what this does, it allows people to theorize that and be comfortable with their speculation, but without ever having to really defend their position, right? And this tradition actually started a long time ago, and it has gone unchallenged for so long that it's frankly become established as factual, for lack of a better term. John Chrysostom was a Christian bishop, right? And notable preacher from the 4th and 6th centuries AD in Syria and in Constantinople. And he was very famous for being an eloquent speaker and for his preaching. And he speculated that the star was not really a star at all, but an angel who visually guided the Magi to the exact spot where the young child was. So like I said, we're talking somewhere between 350 and 400 AD is when John Chrysostom wrote this down in his homilies on Matthew. right? So that means for at least 1600 years, this has been a common theory, right? So I got several quotes here from Chrysostom's homilies on Matthew. I'll just read you one, maybe two here. Let's get you one. Well, here it says, this star was not of the common sort, or rather not a star at all, but some invisible power transformed into this appearance. There is not any star that moves this way. For it appears, here you go, look at this, right? You talk about Christian mythology. For it appears not in the night, but in midday, while the sun is shining, from appearing and hiding itself again. For on their way as far as Palestine, it appeared leading them, but after they set foot within Jerusalem, it hid itself. Then again, when they had left Herod, having told them on what account they came and were on the point of departing, it shows itself. And see, all of which is not like the motion of a star, but of some power highly endued with reason. In other words, they're saying this thing thought, right? For it had not even any course, it had no course of its own, et cetera, et cetera. And he compares it to the pillar of cloud in the wilderness, that it led the Magi the same way the pillar led the Jews in the wilderness wanderings, right? And then this particular quote, which is from Homilies on Matthew, book 4, chapter 3, says that finally the star did point out a spot so confined just the space of a manger and a shed. So in other words, this is that notion then that the star shone like a pin spot down on the place where Jesus was. So this goes way back there, but this is fanciful, right? And it doesn't really go with the text because it's not an angel. Guys, I'm sorry. I know there are records in Job and in Revelation that equate the word star with the word angel. But when you read those carefully in Job and Revelation, in the direct context, there you go. In the direct context, they make the connection between stars and angels. So in this context, in Matthew chapter 2, there is no connection between a star and an angel. Okay, so moving on. They try to claim that it was an angel. That's really, really hard to believe for a wide variety of reasons. Because number one, the text really doesn't indicate that it was an angel. And the notion that the Magi saw something supernatural or miraculous and did not describe it that way is frankly just sophomoric. It's really cheap. It's a really cheap explanation to get out of having to explain this. And then frankly, likewise, is the same is true for the Shekinah glory, right? That somehow this was the Shekinah or Shekinah glory of God. It's the same thing because by claiming it's miraculous or supernatural, it's like, well, how do you prove that? How do you prove or disprove that, right? But once again, the text doesn't really say that, right? The text, we know who the wise men were. Okay, we have documentation that these guys were astronomers and astrologers. So if they come to you saying, we have seen a star, then that is the natural conclusion. Okay, and if we were in a court of law, right? If we were presenting our evidence in a court of law, this is where that phrase reasonable doubt would come in, right? Because if a group of astronomers comes to me and says, hey, we want to tell you about this really significant sighting that we saw in the night sky last year, why would I assume for a second that they're not talking about stars? Because that's who these guys are. They're astronomers, and they're talking about seeing stars. For me to try to make the assumption that they're talking about something else, that is not reasonable, okay? That is not a reasonable doubt, and that wouldn't stand up in a court of law, okay? The opposing attorney would object to that notion, and the judge would say, objection sustained, strike that from the record, Okay. If we were in a court of law, that is what would happen. But part of the reason I'm going on and on about this angel and the possibility of the Shekinah glory of God is because, like I've said several times now, by claiming that it was supernatural or something specially created by God just for the occasion, that means you don't have to engage in much explanation. It's really cheap, it's really easy, and you don't have to defend yourself. But the reality of it is that by considering this to be a normal star in its normal course through the heavens, but due to the infinite possibilities of orbits and rotations and position and sighting and stuff like that, for there to be this very conspicuous concentrated series of events. And here's the key: that God set in motion from the creation. That is what makes this extraordinary, okay? Is that God set a prophecy in the stars from the creation that resulted in this highly concentrated series of unprecedented events. And these wise men read the stars and went, oh my, we have to go to Judea right now. Okay, so now let's go on to a couple of other theories. Another theory is that this was a comet. Okay, now this is a very popular theory, but the general text, once again, does not indicate that it's a comet. Now, I've already mentioned the fact that the Greek word aster is used for a variety of where did that come from? Freudian slip. A variety of celestial, that's where it came from. Celestial objects, right? And that could include a comet. That could include a comet. But the plain sense of the text does not point you towards a comet, right? So even the word, although the word could be used for that, you don't get that sense from it, right? So point number one is that the general text does not indicate a comet, okay? Number two, the specific text does not indicate a comet, because even though the Greek word aster could be used, the Greeks also had a specific word for a comet, cometai, right? Which means long-haired star, and they didn't use the alternate word when they could have. It would have been, if they had meant comet, it would have been real easy for them just to say, comet, right? It would have been really, really easy for them to do that. So the general text doesn't indicate it. The specific text does not indicate it. And then so there's a wide variety of reasons why comet doesn't really make sense. But frankly, the most convincing one is the fact that in ancient astrology, comets were an evil omen, not a positive one. Evil omens portended the death of the king, not the birth of the king. So if a Babylonian or a Greek or a Roman astrologer saw a comet, and we have many records of exactly this, right? We have many records of exactly this. If a Babylonian, Greek, or Roman astrologer saw a comet, they would be thinking, oh no, the king is going to die, right? And we've got some really, really interesting historical records that talk about this because, for example, when Julius Caesar died and Augustus was getting ready to take the throne, there was a comet, right? So Augustus, in a brilliant political maneuver, said that, well, no, the comet is just the wandering soul of Julius Caesar. Okay, so he diffused this notion that this comet was an omen of his own death, right? Because it occurred after Julius Caesar died and when he was maneuvering to become emperor, right? So it wasn't an omen about Caesar, it was an omen about him, according to how the astrologers of that time would have interpreted it. So, like I said, in a very clever political maneuver, he just reinterpreted it entirely, and he celebrated it, and he had like coins stamped with the comet on it and stuff like that to change the meaning, because he knew the people would think that's what it meant, right? But the bottom line is that the it was an evil omen. It wasn't a positive omen. So that theory gets blown out of the water pretty quickly. And then let's also talk about the fact that about the possibility of it being a nova or a supernova. Okay. Now, nova is the Latin word for new. Okay. So a nova or a supernova is usually used to refer to a new star. Now, this is one of those areas where ancient astronomy and modern astronomy kind of bang heads a little bit, because we now know, okay, that a nova is not a new star. It's not a star being born. Frankly, it's closer to a star dying than it is a star being born. But as far as visually how it would be perceived, and especially if it was visually perceived several thousand years ago when they didn't know what we know today, it would appear to be a quote unquote new star, because what a nova is it's a star that suddenly increases in brightness and then fades out over weeks or months. Now, this fits. See, this in certain ways is a good theory, because most people's idea about the Star of Bethlehem was it was this singular bright star, and that is what a nova or a supernova is it's a singular bright star. So this, out of all the other theories, at least has a little bit of merit, okay, because it fits the description, right? But once again, this would have been kind of on the conspicuous side. Chances are this would have been noticeable to anybody who, looked at it in the night sky, right? So, but this label, of it being, and also, by the way, the label, let me put it this way. The label of nova, okay, calling it a new star, a nova, Nova Stella, okay. Nova Stella is the name of a book written by Tycho Brahe back in the, I guess it would have been the 16th century, right? Did I do my math right? Since I've already botched that once on one of the shows, right? Tycho Brahe, who was a Danish astronomer, wrote a book in 1572 called De Nova Stella, which means concerning the new star, right? So that's when we adopted this label, new, nova, right? And so even though we now know it's technically not a new star, this is what it has been called for millennia. The ancients would have referred to it as a new star, because visually that is how it would have appeared. Okay. And then, like I said, one of the challenges with it being a nova or a supernova is that it would have been conspicuous and it would have been noticeable even by untrained observers. But the death blow is from the fact that, according to Babylonian and Greek and Roman astrology, new stars had no significance. They didn't pay any attention to them, right? So this theory, like I said, although on one hand it fits because at least visually it's what most people assume the Star of Bethlehem looked like, the problem is that the theory itself gets blown out of the water pretty quickly, because ancient astrologers paid no attention to new stars. They did not give them any symbolic significance. So we're running out of time here, but I want to wrap up with a couple of facts here let's see if I can get through these in a couple of minutes, because I want to get you thinking, because maybe this is where we'll go in our next episode. I want you to think about some commonly overlooked points about the Magi when they visited Herod, right? Because this is where all of the pieces of God Save the King come into play, right? Not born on December 25th. Tradition is not evidence, rarely told in its historical context, and we usually take it out of its Jewish context, right? So here's some historical context for us to consider, and that we'll take up here next week. So be thinking about these questions, and let's see if we can answer some of them next week. The Magi came out of the Parthian Empire and traveled into Roman territory. The Parthians and the Romans were enemies. Okay? They were enemies. Very important, right? Here's another unknown fact. The Magi were not unknown to Herod. Okay? the entire region would have known who the Magi were, because the Magi had been famous throughout the ancient Near East for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So everybody knew who they were. Everybody knew about this scholarly class of Mesopotamian astronomer and astrologers. Everybody knew who they were. So they wouldn't have been a mystery to Herod. He would have known full well who they were and what their job description was, right? Now, despite Judea being a client kingdom of Rome, and Rome and Parthia being enemies, there would have been diplomatic relations and foreign policy between Judea and Mesopotamia, right? Okay, next, the Magi already knew that Herod was a Roman appointee. That was not a mystery. They knew he was a Roman appointee. They knew he was a pretender, not a legitimate king of Judea. Ooh, not a legitimate king. So very interesting that when they show up in the record in Matthew chapter 2, they had no fear or hesitation about confronting Herod. None. No fear, no hesitation of traveling into enemy territory and confronting an illegitimate king, right? Next, and maybe this is where we'll wrap. Yeah, well, let me make one or two more points here and we'll wrap up, because this will give us a really good, nice crescendo into the end, and then we can say goodbye for the day. So they had no fear or hesitation confronting Herod, and here it is. They were convinced. They were convinced that they were going to find a great king, the Hebrew Messiah, and they possibly even knew he was the King of Kings, because the phrase "we have come to worship him" this doesn't indicate that they were just paying homage to a foreign king, right? On a strictly diplomatic mission. This tends to indicate that they were coming fully prepared to submit themselves to this great king's rulership. Okay? And that's perfect, because that's a great cliffhanger. We can leave it right there, that the Magi appear to have been coming to visit this new king, this great king of the Jews, and submit themselves to his rulership. So these are widely unknown, or at least not strongly considered, facts of the nativity story concerning the Magi. So, well, we're going to wrap it up there, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Tim Keyes. I am the host of God Save the King. And of course, you can listen to God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. We'll see you next time.